March 15th, March 1783. A long wooden building at an army camp above the Hudson River near Newburgh, New York. The war is over in every sense except the legal one. The fighting has stopped. The treaty has not been signed, and the Continental Army is sitting in a camp, waiting, with nothing to do but count what it is owed. The officers have not been paid in years. In 1780, Congress promised them half pay for life. That promise has never been funded, and in 1782 the pay stopped altogether. Their formal petition, sent to Philadelphia in December, carried a sentence that reads like a warning because it was won. Our distresses are now brought to a point. We have borne all that men can bear. Congress has answered by not answering. 7 states have voted for it. 9 are needed. The resolution is postponed. And in the first weeks of March, anonymous letters begin circulating around the camp. They are well written. They urge the officers to stop appealing to the justice of their government and start appealing to its fears. A meeting is called. Washington bans it and calls his own for the 15th. General Horatio Gates opens that meeting, and then Washington walks in, unannounced, and asks to speak. He reads them an address. He asks them, in the name of their common country, to express their utmost horror and detestation of the man who would attempt to open the floodgates of civil discord. And then he takes out a letter he has brought with him, a letter from a congressman in Virginia, setting out what Congress had and had not managed to do about their pay, and he cannot read it. He stops. He takes a pair of spectacles out of his pocket, and he asks the room to forgive him while he puts them on. He observes, as he does it, that he has grown gray in their service and now finds himself growing blind. Nobody wrote down his exact words. The officer taking the minutes wrote down what they meant. Major Samuel Shaw, aide to General Knox, writing it up shortly afterwards, there was something so natural, so unaffected in this appeal, as rendered it superior to the most studied oratory. It forced its way to the heart, and you might see sensibility moisten every eye. The meeting ends with the officers voting their confidence in Congress. Whatever was going to happen in that room does not happen. Now hold that scene, because there is a detail in it that almost nobody notices. Washington did not need the spectacles to read his own speech. He needed them to read the letter from Congress. The blindness arrives at the exact moment he has to decipher the government's explanation of why there is no money. So let me tell you what was in that letter. In numbers, between 1781 and 1787, the Continental Congress asked the 13 states for something in the order of $10 million. It received about $1.5 million, 15%. In 1781, it requested $3 million and received $39,138. And for one 6-month stretch in 1786 and 1787, the entire Treasury of the United States of America took in $663. The country in that room does not have a tax, it has a request. So here's the question this video exists to answer. How does a government that cannot collect $663 in 6 months become, 5 years later, a state that borrows money in Amsterdam at 4%? Because it did. And the way it did it is the least romantic and most consequential thing that happened in the founding of the United States. Let me put the thesis plainly, because there are 2 halves and both of them are uncomfortable. The first is that America won its independence with money that died, not metaphorically. The currency that paid for the Continental Army lost essentially all of its value. The men who fought were paid in paper that nobody believed, and the United States defaulted on France, the ally without whom it would have lost. The second half is the part that gets left out. The real country was not founded in 1776, and it was not founded in 1783. It was founded in 1790 when a government that had every excuse to walk away from that paper decided instead to honor it, and the bill for that decision was paid overwhelmingly by the people who had earned the paper in the first place. And I'm going to show you something at the end of this that is almost never said out loud. Funding the debt at par did not pay 100 cents on the dollar. On the market, it paid about 50. This is the history you were not taught. Now, to see how the money died, you have to start earlier than the country. On the 22nd of June, 1775, the Continental Congress resolved that a sum not exceeding 2 million Spanish milled dollars be emitted in bills of credit for the defense of America. Look at the date. That is a year before the Declaration of Independence. Congress created a currency before it created a country, before there was any government with the power to tax anybody to back it. Over the next 4.5 years, there were 11 emissions. The best modern accounting puts the new money actually issued at almost exactly $200 million, plus another $41.5 million printed to swap out bills that were too worn to circulate or too easy to forge. And there were no emissions at all after November 1779. To feel the scale, forget conversions into modern money, they are meaningless across 2.5 centuries. Use a ratio instead. Those $200 million were roughly equal to the entire annual output of the American economy. And now the part that changes how you should read everything that followed, because it is not what you were taught. Those bills were not banknotes in the modern sense. Each emission carried a printed date, and each resolution of Congress set out a schedule for its own redemption. The first issue to be pulled in by quarters over 4 specified years. The redemption was to happen through tax quotas assigned to each state. The state would collect the bills from its own citizens and burn them, which means the Continental dollar was closer to a bearer bond than to a dollar bill. It was a promise to be paid at a date in the future, and it was transferable. And the moment you see it that way, its price makes different sense. A bond that matures in 4 years does not trade at face value. It trades at a discount, and the discount widens as people doubt the payment. So a substantial part of what 2 centuries of historians have called the depreciation of the Continental was not depreciation at all. It was a market pricing a bond.
I should be straight with you. This is a minority position.
It comes from the economist who did the archival accounting. It has been published and praised, and most of the profession still explains the collapse the older way. Too much paper, no taxing power, states that would not comply. But both camps agree about when the floor gave way, and both agree about why. In January 1779, and again in March 1780, Congress went back and retroactively rewrote the redemption dates on every emission it had ever made. The new schedule required payments of over $10 million a year for 18 consecutive years from a Congress that could not collect $39,000. Nobody could believe it, and nobody did. The promise died first, the paper died second. Here is the curve. In January 1770, it took about $1.25 of paper to buy $1 of silver. By January 1779, 8. By January 1780, over 40. By January 1781, 100. By that April, 167. And on March 18, 1780, Congress formally called the bills in at 40 to 1. Look at that number against the market. The market was already past 50, heading for 60. Congress did not devalue its currency that day. It ratified a devaluation that had already happened, at a rate the market had already left behind. That is the whole condition of the United States in 1780, in one act of legislation, a government running behind its own money, trying to catch up. By May 1781, the Continental had effectively stopped circulating. And here I have to take away a phrase you have heard your whole life, because it is not real. Not worth a Continental. It is the single most famous thing anyone ever said about this currency, and no American of the Revolution ever said it. When the archives were searched, newspapers, letters, diaries, the expression does not appear. Its earliest attested use is from the middle of the 19th century. It was coined 2 generations later by Americans fighting an entirely different argument about money, who needed a corpse to point at. Now, there is one more actor in the death of the Continental, and it is the most cinematic thing in this story. The British were counterfeiting it, officially at scale, and in public. They ran presses aboard a warship, HMS Phoenix, moored in New York Harbor from 1776. And on the 14th of April 1777, the Loyalist New York Gazette carried an advertisement offering counterfeit Congress notes to anyone traveling into the other colonies, for the price of the paper per ream, adding that they were so neatly executed there was almost no risk of anyone noticing. Washington sent a copy of that advertisement to Congress 4 days later, with the observation that no artifice was left untried by the enemy to injure them. In 1779, an American frigate captured a British ship carrying materials for counterfeiting the currency, types, and paper with silk and isinglass worked into it. In January 1780, the British commander-in-chief admitted in a letter to London that he had tried the arts of counterfeiting. Congress fought back with technology, marbled edges that could not be reproduced, flakes of mica pressed into the paper, blue fibers, 2-color printing, detection sheets circulated to the public. But, and this matters, the counterfeiting did not kill the Continental. There is no reliable estimate of how much fake money was in circulation, and every figure you will see quoted is a guess. Franklin gave the honest version himself. The forgeries hurt, he said, first by the vast additional quantity, and next by the uncertainty in distinguishing the true from the false. It accelerated a collapse that arithmetic had already guaranteed. And while we are correcting the picture, here's who actually paid for the American Revolution, because it is not who you think. The best reconstruction of war finance breaks down roughly like this. Paper money issued by the 13 states, about 39%. Paper issued by the Continental Congress, about 28%. Certificates of debt issued by the states, another 14%. Certificates issued by Congress, about 10 foreign loans, 6, and voluntary domestic lending, people actually buying bonds, about 3. Add the first and third of those, and you get the headline. The states financed more than half the war. The Continental Congress was not the principal financier of the American Revolution. The foreign money was real, but smaller than the legend. France provided something over $6 million of principal in loans, plus around $2 million more in outright subsidies that were never loans at all. The Dutch lent, and Spain lent a little. Total foreign principal owed on January 1790, about $10 million. And then there is that 10% of congressional certificates, which deserves its own sentence because of what it actually was. When the army needed grain, horses, wagons, or forage, it took them, and it left behind a piece of paper. The historian who cataloged this called them involuntary credit extensions, which is a very polite phrase. In plain terms, the Continental Army paid for a significant part of its supplies with receipts it wrote itself, handed to farmers who had no choice, redeemable at no stated date. That paper is going to come back at the end of this story, and it is going to be worth something, just not to the farmer. Because now we get to what all of this does to an army. A private soldier in 1775 was promised $6.67 a month. When Congress raised military pay in 1778, the increase went to the officers, not to the men. And they were not paid on time. Arrears ran to years. One soldier's memoir, written half a century later, so take it as a memory rather than an account book, records receiving 1,200 paper dollars and spending the entire sum on a single quart of rum. On the 1st of January 1781, at a camp in New Jersey, about 1,500 men of the Pennsylvania line mutinied. One officer was killed and 2 more were shot. The mutineers marched on Princeton, intending to continue to Philadelphia and present their case to Congress directly. The British commander in New York saw the opportunity and sent emissaries with an offer, full pardon, full pay, in real money, for anyone who came over. The mutineers arrested the British agents and handed them over to be hanged. Then they kept marching on their own Congress. That is the exact temperature of the American Revolution in 1781. Men who would not take enemy gold at any price, and who were prepared to march on their own government with muskets to get what they were owed. And 2.5 years later, they got there. On the 20th of June, 1783, about 400 soldiers surrounded the Pennsylvania State House in Philadelphia, the building we now call Independence Hall, with fixed bayonets, demanding settlement of their accounts. Inside, Alexander Hamilton chaired the committee sent out to negotiate. The government of Pennsylvania was asked to call out the militia to protect the Congress of the United States. It refused. And the Congress of the United States discovered that there was no authority in America obliged to protect it. So it left. It packed up and moved to Princeton, and over the following years it wandered, Annapolis, Trenton, New York. Read Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, and you will find the consequence, written down 4 years later, a federal district, not more than 10 miles square under the authority of Congress alone and no state. The United States has a capital city of its own because its own unpaid soldiers threw the government out of the last one. Which brings us back to that room at Newburgh, 3 months earlier, and to what actually got decided there. On March 22, 1783, a week after Washington's spectacles, Congress commuted the officers' half pay for life into 5 years of full pay, payable in money or in 6% securities. 2,480 officers were eligible. Now, I want to be careful about Newburgh because it is one of the most argued over episodes in American history. In 1970, a historian made a serious charge that a faction in Congress, nationalists who wanted the federal government to have the power to tax, deliberately stoked the Army's anger in order to force the state's hand, and that some officers were contemplating direct action. Another historian rebutted it. A recent book argues there was never an organized conspiracy at all, just rumors, private conversations, and badly coordinated ambition. So here is what is not in dispute. The officers were unpaid. Men in Congress wrote letters to each other, observing that the Army's anger was politically useful. One of them wrote to a general that the Army have swords in their hands, and that the general knew enough of the history of mankind to understand. Much more than the writer had dared put on paper. And Washington was invited in writing to put himself at the head of that anger and use it. He refused. Whether anybody would actually have pulled the trigger is still being argued about. That the laver existed, and that it was noticed, is not. Now let me introduce you to the man who was holding the whole thing together, because his story is the story in miniature. Robert Morris became Superintendent of Finance in 1781, effectively the first finance minister of the United States, at a moment when the United States had no revenue. What he did was extraordinary and slightly insane. He founded the Bank of North America, which opened in Philadelphia in January 1782, the first corporation ever chartered by the federal government of the United States. He subscribed most of its shares on behalf of the government, using the hard money that had come from France. And he issued notes signed with his own name, personal promissory notes from a private merchant circulating as the de facto currency of the federal government. He put together over $1.4 million for the march to Yorktown, French silver, borrowed money, and his own notes, the whole thing held up by his own name. Read that again, because it is the sentence that explains the whole period. The decisive campaign of the American Revolution was financed against the private signature of a Philadelphia merchant because the government's own signature was worthless. In 1783, when Congress voted 3 months' pay to the men it was sending home and had no money to pay it with, Morris issued more personal notes. And at the gates of the camp, the speculators were waiting with silver. Washington saw it coming. In his general orders of the 21st of May, 1783, he warned the men explicitly not to part with their certificates at a heavy discount, and told them that the men buying them would be the ones collecting the full value. They sold anyway. Most of them had to. A certificate paying 6% at some unspecified future date is not something you can eat on the road home to Massachusetts. As for Morris, he speculated on Western land after the war, betting on European immigration that did not arrive in time. The panic of the mid-1790s destroyed him. In February 1798, he entered the debtors' prison on Prune Street in Philadelphia, and he stayed there until 1801, when he was released under the First Federal Bankruptcy Act, a law his own case had helped to pass. The man who personally signed for Yorktown died in obscurity, having spent 3.5 years in a cell for debt. Now, the certificates, because this is where the moral argument of the American founding actually lives. The demobilized soldier did not get money. He got paper in layers, depreciation pay to compensate for the currency, then Morris notes, then final settlement certificates issued from 1784 carrying 6% interest and no credible date of payment. What happened to that paper is measurable but only in patches. The historian who went through the surviving subscription registers found that in Maryland, 82% of the Army certificates had changed hands, against 63% of the ordinary loan certificates. His judgment on the country as a whole is blunter and less precise. Nearly all the soldiers and most of the officers sold their securities soon after receiving them, and the price depended entirely on where you lived. In New England and in the South, where no state did anything to hold them up, soldiers' certificates changed hands at 10 or 15 cents on the dollar. In New York and New Jersey, 20. In Pennsylvania, once the state backed them with taxes and land, 30 to 40. So the honest range is 1/10 to 2/5 of face value, not pennies, and nothing remotely like par. And I'm not going to tell you they were robbed because the honest description is stranger and worse. Nobody stole anything. A market did what markets do to a promise that nobody believes. The people who kept believing were paid 7 years later, not in full, as we will see, but paid, and the men who had earned the promise were not in the room when it was honored. And in the meantime, those same men were being taxed. On March 23, 1786, Massachusetts levied the heaviest direct tax in a generation to meet the requisitions of Congress and to service its own war debt, which was largely held by creditors in Boston. And it required that 1/3 of that tax be paid in coin, in gold or silver, for the first time since 1781. In the western farming counties of Massachusetts, there was almost no coin at all. Land taxes had already risen by something like 60% in 3 years. County courts began issuing judgments, farms went to auction, often at 1/3 of their value, debtors went to prison. So here's the scene. A man who fought in the Continental Army, who was paid in a certificate he had to sell at 1/3 of its value, is now sued as a debtor by the state, which still owes him money for a tax he cannot pay and a medal he has never seen. In August 1786, around 1,500 men shut down the court at Northampton. Others closed courts across the state. And on the 25th of January 1787, Daniel Shays led about 1,500 men against the federal arsenal at Springfield. The militia commander fired warning shots and then fired artillery into them. 4 men were killed. And now watch the money, because it is perfect. The army that put the rebellion down, 4,400 men under Benjamin Lincoln, was financed by a private subscription raised among the merchants of Boston. The creditors of Massachusetts paid for the army that suppressed the debtors of Massachusetts. Washington, hearing about it, wrote to a friend that there were combustibles in every state which a spark might set fire to. I will not tell you Shays caused the Constitution. The movement for a convention was already underway before he marched, and the Annapolis meeting had already called for one. What Shays did was make it unstoppable. He turned a technical argument about federal revenue into a moral emergency, and he brought delegates to Philadelphia who would otherwise have stayed at home. Which brings us to January 1790, and to the decision. The new government under the Constitution has been running for less than a year, and the Secretary of the Treasury lays before Congress an accounting of what the United States owes. Owed abroad $11.7 million, owed at home by the federal government somewhere around 40 to 42 million, depending on how you treat unpaid interest, debts of the individual states, estimated about 25 million. Call it $79 million on his own figures. Now set that against income. Servicing that debt on its original terms would cost around $4.5 million a year. The customs revenue actually collected by the Treasury of the United States in 1789 was $162,000. $4.5 million owed in interest, $162,000 collected. And the securities themselves were trading in January 1788 at $11.67 for every $100 of face value. That is what the world thought an American promise was worth, about 11 cents. By the time Hamilton wrote his report, the mere existence of a real government had pushed that to 35. It was still barely a third of face value. Hamilton's proposal was that every dollar of it should be paid in full to whoever was holding the paper. James Madison, his closest political ally through the writing of the Constitution, rose against him. Madison's proposal was called discrimination. The present holder would receive the highest market value the security had ever reached. The remainder would be paid to the original holder, the soldier, the farmer, the supplier who had taken the paper first. It is the morally obvious answer. It is also administratively close to impossible, requiring the government to trace the provenance of every certificate in America. On February 22, 1790, the House rejected it, 36 votes to 13. The other fight was assumption, whether the federal government should also take over the war debts of the states, and that one was settled, according to the only account we have over dinner. Jefferson tells the story, meeting Hamilton outside the president's door, looking, he says, somber, haggard, and dejected beyond description, even his dress uncouth and neglected, walking him up and down for half an hour, then inviting him to dinner. With Madison the next evening, Madison would stop blocking assumption. The permanent capital would go to the Potomac. I have to flag that, because everything anybody knows about that dinner comes from one man, writing it down later, in an account in which he is the honest broker between two rivals. It probably happened. It almost certainly decided less than he claimed. The capital question was being settled through other channels anyway, and the deal included an adjustment of about $1.5 million in Virginia's favor that Jefferson does not mention. The Residence Act passed in July 1790. Assumption passed the House on the 26th of July, 34 to 28. The Funding Act was signed on the 4th of August. And now here's the thing about that famous phrase, funding at par, that almost nobody says. It did not pay 100 cents on the dollar. The exchange was voluntary, face value for face value, but into a basket of 3 different new securities. For federal debt, 2/3 in a 6% bond and 1/3 in a bond that paid no interest at all until 1801. Unpaid back interest was converted into a 3% bond. So a creditor holding $100 of principal plus $47.60 of arrears, $147.60 owed, received on the 10th of November 1790 a package of new securities worth $72 and 28 cents on the open market, 49 cents for every dollar owed. By January 1791, it was up to about 63 cents. Hamilton himself, writing to Washington, put the package at around $73 for 100 of principal. An economist who went through the numbers concluded that a large part of the face value of the American debt was effectively written off and compared the operation to the debt restructurings that were done for Latin American countries in the 1990s. Hamilton did not pay 100 cents on the dollar. He paid about 50 and called it par. And if you want the genuinely regressive transfer in this story, the one that actually cost the poorest Americans the most, it is not the certificates at all. It is the Continental dollar. Under the Funding Act, old Continental bills were accepted at 100 to 1. $100 of the money that had paid for the Revolution bought $1 of interest-bearing federal debt. Congress estimated about $6 million of face value was ever presented. Something between $72 and $74 million of face value was never redeemed at all. That paper was in the hands of ordinary people, disproportionately the poorest, because it was the money everybody had been paid in. And 3 successive secretaries of the Treasury spent the next 10 years refusing petitions to reopen the question. So the United States funded the certificates held by merchants and investors at something close to half their value and settled the currency held by everybody else at 1%. Both of those things are true, and any honest account has to carry both. Now, what did it buy? The conversion was voluntary, and by the end of 1794, about 98% of the debt had been exchanged. Creditors chose this. They could have held out for better terms, and they did not, because a discounted claim on a government that pays is worth more than a full claim on one that does not. Federal revenue went from $162,000 in 1789 to over 4.5 million in 1793 to nearly 11 million by 1800, funded above all by customs duties and by a new excise on distilled spirits in 1791, whose precedes the law explicitly assigned to paying the interest on the debt. That whiskey tax produced an armed rebellion in western Pennsylvania 3 years later, which the federal government put down with 13,000 militia. The bill for credibility kept arriving in installments. And the borrowing rate did what it was supposed to do. American loans in Amsterdam went from 5% in 1790 to 4.5% at Antwerp by the end of 1791 to 4% in January 1792. In 4 years, the credit of the United States went from 11 cents on the dollar to borrowing at 4% alongside the established powers of Europe. But I want to give you the fragility too, because the triumphalist version is not true either. In 1792, debt service was consuming about 87% of federal revenue. The country was not healthy. It was credible. Those are different things. And the second one is what you can borrow against. 11 years later, that same signature bought Louisiana, financed through 2 European banking houses, with the bonds placed in London and Amsterdam. A country that could not collect $663 in 1787 bought a third of a continent in 1803 on credit. And there is one last account to settle, which is France. The United States stopped paying interest to France in 1785 and defaulted on the principal installments due in 1787. Regular payments resumed only in 1790. The French debt was ultimately refinanced with new Dutch borrowing and bought out in 1795 by an American merchant acting on his own account. So America defaulted on the France of the monarchy, the France that had made its independence possible, and that was at that very moment being destroyed by the cost of it, and then paid the France of the Revolution using Dutch money. There is a video on this channel about what that war did to French public finances. Watch them together and the two halves of the same transaction fit exactly. Now I want to be careful here because this subject has its own conspiracy literature, and it is 100 years old. In 1913, the historian Charles Beard argued that the Constitution was essentially the work of men holding public securities, acting in their own financial interest against farmers and debtors. It is a powerful story, and the strong version of it is dead. In 1958, another historian reconstructed the economic holdings of the delegates to the Philadelphia Convention and to the state ratifying conventions, some 1,800 men, and the votes simply do not divide the way Beard's thesis requires. In Pennsylvania, in South Carolina, and in New York, a majority of the public security holders voted against ratification. And there is a documentary limit here that ought to be stated plainly, because it protects you from anyone who claims certainty in either direction. Much of the Treasury's central record was destroyed in a series of fires, 1801, 1814, and an arson in 1833. What survives is a handful of state registers, and historians have been extrapolating from them ever since. There is no reliable national picture of the ownership of that debt, and there never will be. Anyone who quotes you a precise national figure is estimating. What does survive is the weaker and more interesting version. The debt did concentrate, moving from a very large number of original holders to a smaller number of urban and coastal investors disproportionately in the North. That is not seriously contested. And the Constitution was, among other things, a machine built to make a government able to tax and to borrow. Part of that design was deliberately putting certain economic decisions beyond the reach of local majorities. Read Article 1, Section 10, where the states are forbidden to issue paper money or to pass laws impairing contracts. That is not a coup, it is a design choice. It was argued about in the open, and the people who lost that argument understood exactly what they were losing. 3 more corrections quickly, because they come up every time. Hamilton is endlessly quoted as saying a national debt is a national blessing. What he wrote in a private letter in 1781 was that a national debt, if it is not excessive, will be to us a national blessing. The condition is in the original. And in the report of 1790, he explicitly rejects the doctrine that public debts are public benefits, calling it a position inviting to prodigality and liable to dangerous abuse. The Bank of the United States, chartered in 1791, was not a foreign-owned central bank and never has been. Congress voted its charter, and the federal government took 1/5 of its stock. The serious objection to it was the constitutional one. Jefferson, Madison, and Randolph all argued that Congress had no such power, and that argument was settled only by Washington's own decision. And on the insider dealing, the honest version is not that Hamilton profited, it is that his own deputy did. The Assistant Secretary of the Treasury lasted 7 months and resigned in 1790, then speculated on an enormous scale while an old shortfall of nearly $250,000 left over from his years running the Confederation's Board of Treasury sat unaccounted for on the government's books. When the Treasury finally sued him for it, he could not pay. He triggered the first financial panic in American history in 1792, was arrested, and died in a debtor's prison. The system was nearly destroyed by insider speculation in its second year. That is a better story than a conspiracy, and it has the advantage of being documented. So what is this really about? It is about the fact that a country's credit has almost nothing to do with its wealth. America in 1786 was not poor. It had land, harbors, harvests, timber, a growing population, and no serious external enemy. What it did not have was anybody who believed it would pay. And the thing that changed between 1786 and 1794 was not the discovery of gold or the arrival of a windfall. It was a decision to pay a debt that could have been walked away from at a moment when walking away was easy, popular, and arguably just. Because notice what the alternative was. Repudiation in 1790 would have been the democratic option. The debt was held by a minority, and by a minority who had mostly bought it cheap from the people who earned it. The government chose the creditors, and it did so knowing exactly who was going to absorb the cost. The certificate holders got about 50 cents on the dollar. The Continental holders got one. That is the trade. It built a state that could borrow, and it did it by disappointing the poorest claimants in the country. Both halves are true, and a history that only tells you one of them is selling you something. And that trade has never gone out of use. Every government that has ever restructured a debt has faced the same question, and it is never a choice between honesty and dishonesty. It is a choice about which creditor to disappoint. There is always one, and states almost always choose the one who cannot take their money somewhere else, the citizen, the pensioner, the person holding the currency, rather than the bond. Rome did it with a bronze coin. Revolutionary France did it with the assignat. The Confederacy did it with a note payable 2 years after a peace that never came. And the United States, in the same act that made it creditworthy forever, did it at 100 to 1. Go back to that room at Newburgh one last time. Every man in it was owed money by the government he had fought for. Almost every one of them sold what he was owed, at a fraction, to somebody with silver. 7 years later, it was honored at face value on paper, at about half that in the market, and to whoever happened to be holding it. The Republic was born bankrupt, and then it made itself believed. It just never made itself fair, and the two were connected. If you made it this far, drop a pair of spectacles in the comments, so I know you stayed until the end. And tell me where you land on the vote of the 22nd of February 1790. Madison proposed paying the current holder the highest price the paper had ever fetched on the market, and sending the difference to the veteran who had earned it. It was administratively almost impossible. It might have wrecked the market for American debt at the exact moment that market was being created. And it was fair. The House threw it out 36 to 13. Were they right? I read every one of them. If this kind of deep dive is what you come here for, subscribe. It genuinely helps these keep coming. I'll see you in the next one.